So here's After Effects. And let's have a project. And okay, so if you say watch folder render here, file watch folder, and this everyone's after version of After Effects will have these features here. File watch folder, and then it asks you to pick a folder to watch for renders. And then it will begin looking for stuff to render in that folder. Now, you don't need a second After Effects license. You know, if you notice that thing called After Effects Render Engine that ships every copy of After Effects, that will run on any computer, of the same OS type, without having to be registered. Right? That you can't do anything with that but render. All you can do in After Effects Render Engine is do that watch folder that I just said. It just looks for. It still has whatever plugins you've installed in After Effects. You can't actually create projects in it or edit them. All it does is for folder render. In fact, why don't I just demonstrate that right now? Here is After Effects. Here is the After Effects Render Engine. Start it up. And that's what's running on these computers. So to connect to the render computers, and I'm going to get into our wiki here, so you have this info. For today. Just a second. Antonio just sent us the login info, and I'll paste that into the wiki so you've all got it. But yes, here's After Effects Render Engine. Notice that everything is grayed out except for watch folder and close. Okay, what's it looking for? It's looking for a project file, but of course we know that a project file needs all your assets with it. So let's see actually if we can run both at once. No, we can't, or at least not easily. So in order to prepare a project, drop into the watch folder, and here. So you connect to that here, right? Connect to server. That's Command K, or from the Finder, go. And then you type in, here we need, come on. So either of these will work. So there's your watch, there's your output. Now, how do I get, so that's what this computer is doing right now. Is running that watch folder, looking for something to render. Okay, so how do you collect your project file with all of its assets and actually render it? You use another command called collect files, which will simply take, and this is good for archiving as well. So here I have my thing, and let's just do something so we can tell that we're actually rendering it. So I'm going to save my project file, and I say collect files. Right, so you have the two are grouped together here. So collect files to send to a computer that's running watch folder. And you have these options: collect source files, none for selected comps, for all comps. And you notice what's here is grayed out for queued comps. That's because we haven't added this to the render queue yet. You must have one thing in your render queue in order to collect files. So I forget where the shortcut is actually, add to render queue. I'm so used to the keyboard shortcut. So here we have a file. You have to give it an output, just like normal. Save your project. Now we're ready for collect files. Collect files, queued comps, and you'll need this, enable watch folder render. I also recommend this, change render output to thing. Then you say collect, and then you put it in the server in the watch folder.
So the queued up files, that seems to solve the problem. Like if you have like a really large number of compositions you don't want to just select the rendered, it allows you to sort of select the very specific comps that you want rendered.
Right.
But what if you're doing sort of multiple passes of the same composition with slight detail, like slight changes to some of the other assets that are in those compositions? The problem that I've run into in the past is that if you
one depends on the next, depends on the next.
Into the render queue with various adjustments to source layers, it'll change all of them, even if you put it into the render queue multiple times.
Yeah, that's tricky. What if the output of one thing, how do you automate all of them if the output of one needs to go to the next?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe there's no way to do it.
Well, I mean, one way, it's not ideal. One thing that I can think of is you build the files all in one project, and while you're working, at human speed, you're rendering out proxies. And I'll show you how to set a proxy, proxy clips. And then when you do your computer render, you say don't use proxies, and we'll re-render them all from scratch. It's time-consuming, but if you're giving this to a computer and like walking away for the evening, it's the computer's time, not your time. That might be one way of dealing with it.
I've done this very same thing.
Here we go. Oh.
You can be in folder and it worked perfectly. I had like 5 files, they were all the same source file. I used some minor changes in them. And then we sent it rendered all of them.
Using the same
file with slight variations of one of my.
Here we go. Oh, it doesn't look like it's rerouting stuff to AE output. It looks like it's just leaving the output in your own file in the watch file. But look, it rendered it. There's our glorious moving yellow square. That's how you do it. You can open this progress report here, watch folder. Do you see how it'll actually tell you whether it started your project. You probably want to give it a more useful name than untitled project, so you know it's yours. And then in this folder here, it actually has a complete report for it rendered this, render is finished. Those web pages are being continuously updated. One nice thing, if it's your own computer and you have like admin access, you can do share screen. But like I don't have admin access to this computer, so I don't have that share screen option. You may have seen it. On a PC, I think you have to install some software called Type VNC or a VNC client. That's the screen sharing, generic term for screen sharing. On a Mac, it's just if you have admin privileges, a button appears that says share screen. And you can just see what's on the monitor, right? Pipe over the network. It's actually a great way to work if you have a little studio at home. And you have computers you want to render. If anyone's doing that, you can ask me about it. But it's perfectly adequate to just open up that web page and look at it while it's being done. So this is a tremendous resource, right? Because you don't need to spend time rendering, and especially for those of you with older computers, because really working in HD takes so long under most circumstances that it can be really helpful. So render 1 and render 2. That's on the wiki. It's within our network. You use Go connect server, and you type in one of these 2 IP numbers, and then you use this render and password, and then drop something via collect files into the. It'll take a little practice, right? It can be frustrating at first. Anything that's wrong will cause it to refuse to go, right? If you haven't checked enable watch folder render. I really don't know why this isn't checked by default, right? Like, this is usually why you're doing this, so why wouldn't it be? Anyway, make sure you've checked that. Make sure you've checked, usually you want to change render output, so it ends up in a predictable place, which is the same folder that you used to render. And you usually want 4 queued comps.
Here's off that comment about rendering stuff.
Mhm.
See right there where you're able to render queue?
Right?
There's a way to add more than one
Right.
output module.
Right. If you want to collect these and say duplicate, Command D, or edit duplicate, you can output many different kinds of files from one master, and it pretty much is the same render time, right? Because most of that time is spent calculating what the frame is going to be, not actually writing the file to disk. So you can duplicate this and have it on. It does take some additional time, but if you have a bunch of different versions you want to create, this can be a really efficient way of doing it. I usually prefer to render one lossless PNG master that I like, and then render it, or ProRes if it's not super important, and then render it to a bunch of other functions from there.
There's something else too called render and replace. I never used it before.
Huh, render and replace.
Yeah.
Where is that?
Where what happens is after you render it,
Mhm.
it replaces it in other comps as the rendered
Huh.
video.
Now, how is that different from a proxy?
Because it is proxy,
Okay.
but usually for proxy we're making it smaller. But in this case, I feel like it's what I was thinking about, where
Yeah.
there's an element or a pre-comp that he wants to do, and then go to the next thing and render it with
Right.
what's already in there.
Interesting. Huh. That's something to look at. I don't see in the.
You can chain.
I don't see render and replace in the. Oh, well, that's because it's having a little freak out here. It's not rendering anything. Oh, render an email. Weird. Let's see. I don't see render and replace.
It might actually be in the. What's the thing above output module? Input
Render settings. Okay.
render something?
Well, let's see. The other thing, has anyone used proxies? Oops. Why are we? Oh, wrong key. Yeah. So duplicate. You can't duplicate the render settings, though. So when you have this render thing, you can set a proxy. A proxy is just replacing a comp with a rendered file. It used to be that you couldn't work with like full HD. I remember that is when we had to work. You have to use SD proxies of HD master files, and then you know as a final pass, you would say because you can enable and disable using proxies. You would say use no proxies and render from the originals, which was an incredibly error-prone, annoying process. We don't really need to do that so much anymore, so the use of them is less important. However, for something incremental like that, what we're talking about, this might be useful. So all you do is you right-click and you say set proxy, and then let's pick that. Oh, did I just eject that file that we made? Hold on. There's that file we just rendered on the render machine. Oh, for goodness sakes. There we go. Okay, so I just copied it to my desktop. Right-click, set proxy, file. I went to my desktop, and here we are. So now this little obscure icon here or flag appears. That means this is a proxy. And now when I scrub this, I get this proxy enabled warning. And it looks the same, but notice that if I change something, like say I change this, I just change this to green, this didn't change because we're reading from the file, right? Now, the only reason you want to do this is, let's say this is not a stupid yellow square move around, but something incredibly complex, right? It takes way too much time to render. So you want to set your proxy, and then you can work more quickly. And then if you're doing what you suggested, and let's say you want to render everything from scratch as a watch folder render, then when you do your final render, in the preferences you'd be sure to say no proxies. And then it would render everything from scratch. I find it's often more trouble than it's worth, right, using these, because then it's just an extra couple of bookkeeping. You have to make sure your files are current. You have to render them, you have to replace them. But it's there if you want it, and if you want to experiment with that. If you're doing something very iterative, like output goes into input kind of work, that might be of use. So, just a second.